At my sister's wedding, she walked up to me and said loudly, "You shouldn't be here. You have nothing to offer." Soft laughter rippled among the guests. When it was time for the toasts, I stood up and raised my glass. The words that came out of my mouth made every eye turn to her in shock, and her smile never returned. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the moment Victoria approached me at the reception, her pristine white Vera Wang gown flowing behind her like liquid silk. The Fairmont Olympic Hotel's ballroom glittered with crystal chandeliers and white roses, everything exactly as Victoria had dreamed since we were children. She looked radiant, every inch the perfect bride, her auburn hair swept into an elegant chignon that had probably cost more than my monthly rent. I was standing by the dessert table, nursing my second glass of champagne and trying to blend into the background as I'd been doing my entire life. My simple navy dress, purchased on sale from Nordstrom Rack, felt shabby among the designer gowns and tailored suits of Seattle's social elite. Victoria's friends were all here, successful lawyers, doctors, real estate moguls, and tech executives. James's family was equally impressive, old money from Portland, the kind of wealth that whispered rather than shouted. "Riley," Victoria's voice cut through the ambient chatter like a blade. She positioned herself directly in front of me, her emerald eyes sparkling with champagne and malice. "I need to speak with you." Several nearby guests turned to watch, sensing drama in the air like sharks smelling blood. Victoria had always been gifted at creating an audience for her performances. "Of course," I said quietly, hoping to diffuse whatever was coming. "You look beautiful, Vic. Absolutely radiant." Her laugh was like breaking glass. "Don't try to be sweet now, Riley. It doesn't suit you." She gestured grandly, ensuring maximum visibility from the surrounding crowd. "You know, James and I were just discussing our guest list, and we realized something." My stomach clenched with familiar dread. Victoria had perfected the art of public humiliation over our 32 years of sisterhood, but I'd hoped, foolishly, that her wedding day might bring out some vestige of kindness. "What's that?" I asked, though I already knew nothing good was coming. "We realized that everyone here has something to offer, something meaningful, something valuable." Her voice carried across the elegant space, drawing more attention. Dr. Patterson delivered James when he was born. The Hendersons introduced us at their charity gala. The Washingtons are letting us use their Aspen cabin for our honeymoon. She paused dramatically, savoring the moment like fine wine. "But you have nothing to offer. No connections, no success stories, no impressive achievements. You're just here." Her smile was radiant and cruel. "You shouldn't be here. You have nothing to offer." The laughter that followed was polite but pointed, the kind reserved for uncomfortable moments when people don't know how to respond. I felt heat creep up my neck as dozens of pairs of eyes assessed me, finding me wanting. Victoria's college roommates exchanged knowing glances. James's groomsmen smirked behind their champagne flutes. "Vic!" Our mother's voice carried a note of warning as she approached from across the room, but Victoria waved her off. "Oh, don't defend her, Mom. Riley knows I'm right. She's always known she's the lesser sister." Victoria's voice dropped just enough to seem intimate while remaining audible to our audience. "Some people are meant for greatness, and others are meant to be observers." The words hit their target with surgical precision. I'd heard variations of this speech my entire life, but never so publicly, never with such calculated cruelty. Victoria had chosen her wedding day, the day she was supposed to be at her most generous and loving, to deliver the final blow to whatever remained of our sisterly relationship. I stood there, holding my champagne glass, feeling the weight of judgment from Seattle's finest. Victoria's smile was triumphant, expecting me to retreat in shame, as I'd done countless times before. But today was different. Today, I was done being the lesser sister. Today, I had something to offer after all. The moment stretched between us like a taut wire ready to snap. Victoria basked in the aftermath of her public humiliation, her face glowing with the satisfaction of a job well done. The assembled guests began to drift away, the entertainment value of watching the family black sheep get dressed down having run its course. "Excuse me," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the storm raging in my chest. "I need to use the restroom." Victoria's laugh followed me as I walked away. "Of course you do. Run along, little sister." But I didn't go to the restroom. Instead, I found a quiet corner near the service entrance and pulled out my phone, scrolling through the folder of documents I'd been carrying for 3 months. Photos of bank statements, recorded phone conversations, email threads, legal documents, everything I'd hoped I'd never have to use. The evidence of Victoria's crimes was overwhelming, documented with the thoroughness of someone who'd spent years in forensic accounting before switching to social work. I discovered her financial fraud by accident, stumbled across it while helping our grandmother organize her paperwork. What I'd found had shattered my understanding of the sister I thought I knew. 20 minutes later, the master of ceremonies called for the traditional toasts. James's best man spoke eloquently about friendship and love. Victoria's maid of honor shared charming anecdotes about their college adventures. Our father gave a heartfelt speech about watching his daughter find her perfect match. Then it was time for family toasts. Victoria hadn't asked me to speak. Of course she hadn't. But when the MC asked if anyone else wanted to share words of celebration, I stood up. "I'd like to say something about my sister," I announced, my voice carrying across the ballroom with surprising strength. Victoria's face lit up with genuine surprise, and what might have been gratitude. Perhaps she thought my earlier humiliation had chastened me into proper sisterly behavior. "Riley," she mouthed, touching her heart with apparent emotion. I walked to the microphone, my navy dress suddenly feeling less shabby and more appropriate, like armor worn by someone who had real work to do. "Good evening, everyone. For those who don't know me, I'm Riley Chen, Victoria's older sister." I paused, looking out at the sea of expectant faces. Victoria is right about one thing. I don't have the connections or achievements that most of you have. I work as a social worker, helping families navigate crisis situations. A few polite nods from the crowd. Victoria beamed, probably thinking I was about to deliver some self-deprecating speech that would redeem her earlier cruelty. "But working in crisis intervention has taught me something valuable," I continued, my voice growing stronger. "It's taught me to recognize patterns of abuse, manipulation, and exploitation. It's taught me how predators operate, how they choose their victims, and how they maintain control." The mood in the room began to shift. Victoria's smile flickered. "So, I do have something to offer today. I can offer the truth about who my sister really is." I pulled out my phone and connected it to the ballroom's sound system, the same setup they'd used for the music during dinner. "Victoria, you told me I have nothing valuable to contribute to your special day, but I think your guests, and your new husband, would be very interested to hear these recorded phone conversations between you and your business partner discussing how to manipulate elderly clients into signing over power of attorney." The first recording began to play, Victoria's voice crystal clear through the professional sound system. "Mrs. Henderson is perfect. Lonely widow, no family nearby, complete trust in financial advisors. We can drain her accounts over 6 months and she'll never know what hit her." The silence in the ballroom was deafening. Victoria's face went from confusion to horror to pure panic in the span of 3 seconds. "Or perhaps," I continued as the recording ended, "you'd prefer to hear the one where she discusses falsifying documents to steal from the Alzheimer's patients at Sunset Manor?" Victoria lunged toward the microphone, but James caught her arm, his face a mask of shock and dawning understanding. "Stop," she whispered, but her voice was amplified by the microphone. "Riley, please stop. I have 17 hours of recordings, Victoria. Bank statements showing systematic theft from 12 different elderly clients. Email threads with your accomplice discussing which victims are most vulnerable." I looked directly at her, this beautiful predator in white silk. "You asked what I have to offer? I offer justice for the people you've been destroying." The ballroom erupted in chaos as guests began to comprehend what they were hearing. Victoria's perfect wedding had become her public trial, and I was the prosecutor she'd never seen coming. The chaos in the ballroom was immediate and complete. Guests erupted in shocked conversations while Victoria stood frozen at the head table, her face cycling through denial, rage, and desperation. James had released her arm and stepped back, looking like a man who'd just discovered he'd married a stranger. But to understand how we'd arrived at this moment, you need to know about the shadows that had shaped our childhood, shadows that Victoria had cast over me from the moment I could remember. Growing up in the prestigious Laurelhurst neighborhood, the Chen family appeared perfect from the outside. Our father David was a successful corporate attorney, our mother Margaret a respected pediatrician. We lived in a sprawling Tudor-style house with manicured gardens and a view of Lake Washington. To our neighbors and family friends, we were the ideal family with 2 accomplished daughters. The reality was more complicated. Victoria, 3 years younger than me, had been born with an indefinable magnetism that drew adults to her like moths to flame. She was beautiful from infancy, the kind of child strangers stopped to admire in grocery stores. More importantly, she was charming in a way that seemed almost supernatural. By age 5, she could convince anyone of anything with a combination of wide green eyes, a trembling lower lip, and an intuitive understanding of human psychology. I, on the other hand, was what adults politely called serious. I read voraciously, earned perfect grades, and followed rules with religious devotion. But I lacked Victoria's spark. her ability to light up a room simply by entering it. Where she was effervescent, I was steady. Where she was captivating, I was dependable. Our parents, despite their professional success, fell under Victoria's spell as completely as everyone else. When she wanted something, a new toy, permission to attend a party, forgiveness for breaking curfew, she simply deployed her arsenal of charm and tears until resistance crumbled. When I wanted something, I was expected to make a logical case and accept no as a complete answer. The pattern established itself early and never changed. Victoria's B+ average was celebrated because she was trying her best and had so many other talents. My A+ average was expected because Riley is naturally academic and doesn't have to work very hard for good grades. Victoria's Saturday art classes were encouraged as creative expression. My volunteer work at the animal shelter was nice, but Riley needs to focus on activities that will look better on college applications. The favoritism wasn't malicious. Our parents genuinely believed they were treating us fairly by accommodating our different personalities. They couldn't see that they were teaching Victoria that rules didn't apply to her, while teaching me that my worth was conditional on perfect behavior. By high school, the dynamic had crystallized into something toxic. Victoria was the beloved princess who could do no wrong, while I was the responsible older sister who existed to clean up messes and provide contrast to Victoria's brilliance. When Victoria crashed Dad's car at 17, I was lectured about being a better role model. When Victoria got caught drinking at a party, I was asked why I hadn't been there to watch out for her. The cruelest part was that Victoria seemed genuinely unconscious of the disparity. She loved me in her way, but it was the distant affection of someone who'd never had to compete for attention. She couldn't understand why I sometimes seemed resentful or withdrawn, because from her perspective, she was simply being herself while I was choosing to be less vibrant. "You're so serious all the time, Riley," she'd say with frustration, when I didn't laugh at her jokes or participate in her schemes. "Why can't you just be fun?" What she didn't understand was that I'd learned being fun was her territory, and there wasn't room for both of us in that space. I'd carved out my identity in the areas she didn't want: academics, responsibility, quiet achievement. I became the daughter our parents could depend on, while Victoria became the daughter they delighted in. The pattern followed us to college and beyond. Victoria studied art history at an expensive private school and emerged with connections that led to a lucrative career in financial consulting. I earned a full scholarship to the University of Washington, graduated summa cum laude with degrees in accounting and social work, and chose a career helping families in crisis. Victoria's successes were celebrated with family dinners and social media posts. My achievements were acknowledged with proud but subdued approval, expected rather than exceptional. By the time we reached our 30s, I'd accepted my role as the dependable sister who lived in Victoria's shadow. I'd made peace with being invisible, with being the one who handled problems, while Victoria collected praise. But everything changed the day I discovered what Victoria had been doing to the elderly clients who trusted her with their life savings. Everything changed when I realized that the golden child our family had protected and celebrated was actually a predator. The discovery happened on what should have been an ordinary Tuesday morning in March. I was visiting our grandmother Rose, helping her organize financial documents for her upcoming move to assisted living. At 91, Grandma Rose remained sharp and independent, but managing investments and insurance paperwork had become overwhelming. "Victoria has been such a blessing," Grandma Rose said, as we sorted through bank statements in her sunny kitchen. "She calls every week to check on my portfolio, make sure I'm not missing any opportunities. Such a thoughtful granddaughter." I smiled, pleased that Victoria was staying connected with our grandmother, even as her career kept her increasingly busy. Victoria's financial consulting firm, Emerald Wealth Management, catered to affluent retirees throughout the Seattle area. Her client list read like a who's who of the city's most successful families. "She's moved some of my money into higher yield accounts," Grandma Rose continued, showing me statements from various investment firms. "I don't understand all the details, but Victoria assures me it's all perfectly safe." As I reviewed the documents, my forensic accounting background began to notice irregularities. The patterns were subtle: small withdrawals here, administrative fees there, account transfers that seemed unnecessarily complex. Individually, none of it looked suspicious. Together, it painted a picture that made my stomach clench with dread. "Grandma, can I take copies of these statements? I'd like to review them more carefully." "Of course, dear. Victoria says it's always good to have family members stay informed about financial matters." That evening, I spread Grandma Rose's documents across my dining room table and began the kind of detailed analysis I'd once done for corporate fraud investigations. What I found was a masterpiece of financial manipulation: elegant, sophisticated, and absolutely devastating. Victoria had been systematically draining our grandmother's accounts for over 2 years. The theft was disguised as legitimate investment activities, portfolio rebalancing, and fee structures that would be incomprehensible to someone without financial expertise. Small amounts that wouldn't trigger suspicion, but which collectively totaled nearly $300,000. My hands shook as I documented each discrepancy, each falsified transaction, each forged authorization. This wasn't a mistake or misunderstanding. It was deliberate, calculated theft from a 91-year-old woman who trusted her granddaughter completely. I wanted to believe there was some explanation, some misunderstanding, that would restore my faith in the sister I'd grown up loving despite everything. So I did what I'd been trained to do. I investigated further. Using my professional connections in the financial industry, I began quietly researching Victoria's other clients. What I discovered was a pattern of exploitation that had been occurring for at least 3 years. Elderly clients with substantial assets but limited family oversight. Widows and widowers dealing with grief and confusion about complex financial matters. People with early-stage dementia who might not notice discrepancies in their accounts. Victoria had crafted the perfect crime for the digital age. She used her charm and professional credentials to gain complete trust from vulnerable clients, then gradually transferred their assets to accounts under her control. The thefts were sophisticated enough to avoid detection by casual review, but systematic enough to generate substantial income. The recordings came later, when I began monitoring Victoria's phone calls, using skills I'd learned during my brief stint in corporate security. I told myself I was gathering evidence to protect other potential victims, but the truth was more personal. I needed to hear Victoria discuss her crimes in her own words. I needed to understand how the charming little sister I'd grown up with had become someone who could sleep soundly after stealing from elderly Alzheimer's patients. What I heard in those recordings destroyed whatever remained of my illusions about Victoria's character. She spoke about her victims with casual cruelty, referring to them as marks and easy targets. She laughed about their confusion and gratitude, mocked their loneliness and trust. The warm, charming sister I'd known was revealed as a facade, hiding someone utterly without empathy or conscience. For 3 months, I'd carried this knowledge like a cancer, uncertain what to do with information that would destroy my family and send my sister to prison. I'd consulted with attorneys about my ethical obligations, researched similar cases, and agonized over the choice between family loyalty and justice for Victoria's victims. But watching Victoria humiliate me at her wedding, seeing her bask in the adoration of people who didn't know what she really was, finally broke something inside me. She'd spent our entire lives positioning herself as superior to me, more charming, more successful, more worthy of love and attention. The truth was, I was the better person. I was the one who'd built a career helping vulnerable people instead of exploiting them. I was the one who'd earned my success through honest work instead of theft and manipulation. I was the one who deserved respect and love, not the beautiful predator in the white dress who saw human suffering as an opportunity for profit. So when Victoria told me I had nothing to offer, I realized she was wrong. I had justice to offer. I had truth to offer. I had the power to stop her from destroying any more innocent lives, and I was finally ready to use it. The weeks following my initial discovery about Grandma Rose's missing money became a descent into a nightmare I'd never imagined possible. Each new piece of evidence I uncovered revealed another layer of Victoria's systematic exploitation of vulnerable elderly clients. I started with public records, using my access to professional databases to trace Victoria's business relationships and client connections. Emerald Wealth Management had been operating for 5 years, built on referrals from satisfied customers and Victoria's reputation as a rising star in financial planning. Her client testimonials read like love letters, grateful seniors praising her attention, her caring nature, her ability to explain complex financial matters in simple terms. "Victoria treats me like family," wrote Mrs. Dorothy Patterson, an 86-year-old widow whose husband had died leaving her with substantial assets, but no financial experience. "She calls just to check on me, remembers my grandchildren's birthdays, even brought me soup when I was sick with pneumonia. I trust her completely with my money because I trust her with my heart." Reading Mrs. Patterson's testimonial while knowing what Victoria was actually doing felt like swallowing broken glass. I'd found evidence that Victoria had stolen over $400,000 from Mrs. Patterson's accounts over 3 years, using a combination of unauthorized transfers, inflated fees, and fictitious investment opportunities. The methodology was consistent across all her victims. Victoria would begin each relationship with genuine care and attention, building deep personal connections that went far beyond typical client-advisor relationships. She'd remember birthdays, offer emotional support during health scares, provide practical help with everything from grocery shopping to technology problems. She became indispensable to lonely seniors who had few people in their lives willing to offer such devoted attention. Once trust was established, Victoria would gradually introduce increasingly complex financial arrangements. She'd identify her clients' cognitive vulnerabilities, early memory loss, difficulty processing complex information, tendency to defer to authority figures, and exploit them systematically. She'd convince clients to consolidate their assets under her management, obtain power of attorney for financial decisions, and sign documents they didn't fully understand. The theft itself was sophisticated. Rather than simply stealing lump sums, Victoria created legitimate-seeming investment vehicles and fee structures that slowly drained her clients' accounts. She'd establish shell companies to receive consulting fees, create fake investment opportunities that existed only on paper, and charge portfolio management costs that were pure profit. The money was layered through multiple accounts and investments, making it nearly impossible for victims to trace where their assets had gone. I spent sleepless nights documenting each case, building files that read like a prosecutor's dream. Harold Chen, no relation despite the shared surname, a 93-year-old retired Boeing engineer with early-stage dementia, $280,000 stolen over 2 years. Margaret Washington, a 78-year-old former teacher whose husband had left her a comfortable inheritance, $350,000 transferred to Victoria's accounts through fabricated investment schemes. Robert and Eleanor Martinez, an elderly couple dealing with Eleanor's Alzheimer's diagnosis, $500,000 systematically drained while Victoria posed as their devoted financial advisor and family friend. The pattern was always the same: identification of vulnerable seniors, cultivation of deep personal relationships, gradual assumption of financial control, and systematic theft disguised as legitimate financial management. What made the crimes particularly heartbreaking was the genuine affection these elderly clients felt for Victoria. In recorded phone conversations, I heard them express worry about her well-being, pride in her success, and gratitude for her attention. They loved her like a granddaughter, and she was robbing them blind. Mrs. Patterson called Victoria twice a week just to chat about her garden and her health problems. Harold Chen asked Victoria to be his emergency contact because he had no living family. The Martinez couple invited Victoria to their anniversary celebration because they considered her part of their family. Victoria attended these events, accepted their affection, and continued stealing from them without apparent guilt or hesitation. The most damaging evidence came from Victoria's private communications with her business partner, Marcus Webb, a charming man in his 40s who specialized in elder law and estate planning. Their recorded conversations revealed the calculated nature of their crimes and their complete lack of empathy for their victims. "Mrs. Patterson is getting more confused," Victoria said in one recording I'd captured. "She asked me 3 times last week about the same investment. We should accelerate the timeline and get the rest of her assets transferred before someone in her family starts paying attention." "What about her daughter in California?" Marcus asked. "She calls maybe once a month, never asks about finances. Mrs. Patterson is too proud to admit she needs help, so she doesn't mention anything to her daughter about the money management. We're completely safe." They discussed their victims' psychological vulnerabilities with the clinical detachment of predators studying prey. They strategized about which clients were most isolated, most confused, most likely to sign documents without understanding them. They laughed about the grateful thank you cards they received from people they were systematically destroying. The recordings revealed more than just theft. They revealed the complete absence of human compassion in people who'd built their careers on exploiting society's most vulnerable members. As I compiled the evidence, I realized I was facing an impossible choice between family loyalty and justice for Victoria's victims. But after hearing Victoria mock elderly Alzheimer's patients for their confusion while stealing their life savings, the choice became crystal clear. The weight of knowledge about Victoria's crimes consumed me in ways I hadn't anticipated. For 2 months after confirming the scope of her theft, I carried the evidence like a physical burden, unsure how to proceed without destroying our entire family. My first instinct was to confront Victoria directly, to give her the opportunity to stop the theft and make restitution before involving law enforcement. I rehearsed the conversation dozens of times, imagining scenarios where she'd break down in tears, admit her mistakes, and beg for help in fixing the damage she'd caused. But every time I tried to approach the subject, I remembered the casual cruelty in her recorded conversations with Marcus Webb. The woman who could laugh about exploiting Alzheimer's patients wasn't someone who would respond to appeals to conscience or family loyalty. She was someone who would view my knowledge as a threat to be neutralized. I consulted with 3 different attorneys about my ethical and legal obligations, speaking in hypothetical terms about discovering financial crimes committed by a family member. The advice was consistent. I had no legal obligation to report Victoria's crimes, but I had a moral responsibility to the victims who were being harmed by my silence. If you know that vulnerable elderly people are being systematically robbed and you choose to do nothing, you become complicit in their victimization, one attorney told me bluntly. Family loyalty doesn't supersede the duty to protect innocent victims from ongoing harm, but understanding my moral obligation didn't make the choice easier. Reporting Victoria would destroy our parents, who had already suffered enough disappointment and heartbreak. Dad's law firm represented several of Victoria's clients. The professional embarrassment and potential legal liability would likely end his career. Mom's medical practice served many of the same affluent families whose grandparents Victoria was robbing. The scandal would damage her reputation and possibly her livelihood. More selfishly, I knew that being the family member who exposed Victoria would make me a pariah at family gatherings for the rest of my life. I'd already spent 32 years being the less favored daughter. Reporting Victoria's crimes would make me the daughter who destroyed the family. Our parents would never forgive me, regardless of Victoria's guilt. I began having panic attacks, sudden episodes where I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't function under the weight of carrying such devastating secrets. I'd wake up at 3 a.m. with my heart racing, thinking about Mrs. Patterson counting pills to make them last, because she couldn't afford her medications after Victoria had stolen her money. I'd sit in my car after work, crying about Harold Chen asking the grocery store clerk to help him count change, because he couldn't afford to hire the home health aide he needed. My professional life suffered as I struggled to focus on my own clients' needs while obsessing over Victoria's victims. My supervisor noticed my distraction and declining performance, asking several times if I needed additional support or time off to deal with personal issues. "I'm fine," I'd lie, because explaining the truth would require betraying client confidentiality rules that I'd extended to protecting Victoria despite her never being my actual client. The isolation was the worst part. I couldn't discuss the situation with friends or colleagues without violating ethical guidelines. I couldn't seek support from family members without exposing Victoria's crimes. I couldn't even pursue therapy, because any discussion of ongoing criminal activity would trigger mandatory reporting requirements that could compromise my investigation. For 2 months, I lived in a bubble of knowledge and responsibility that I couldn't share with anyone. I watched Victoria at family dinners, laughing and charming our parents with stories about her successful business and satisfied clients. I sat through conversations where Mom and Dad expressed pride in Victoria's achievements and concern about my apparent stress and withdrawal from family activities. "Riley's been so quiet lately," Mom said during one particularly difficult Sunday dinner. "I worry that she's not happy in her job. Maybe she needs to consider a career change, something more fulfilling and better compensated." "Riley has always been serious," Victoria replied with affectionate condescension. "She just needs to learn to enjoy life more. Not everything has to be so intense and dramatic." The irony was suffocating. Victoria, who was systematically destroying elderly people's lives for profit, was counseling me to be less intense about life. My parents, who'd spent our childhood teaching me that moral behavior was more important than personal success, were suggesting I should model my career after my sister, the financial predator. The breaking point came when I received a call from Mrs. Patterson's daughter in California. She'd grown concerned about her mother's increasing confusion and financial anxiety, and had hired a local attorney to review Mrs. Patterson's accounts. "My mother keeps talking about someone named Victoria who's been helping her with investments," the daughter said. "But when I try to review the paperwork, nothing makes sense. The account statements don't match what my mother thinks she has, and there are all these fees and transfers she can't explain." I sat in my car outside the grocery store, listening to this woman's growing panic as she realized her mother was being victimized, knowing I had evidence that could stop the theft immediately, but feeling paralyzed by family loyalty and fear of consequences. "I think someone is stealing from my mother," Mrs. Patterson's daughter continued. "But she trusts this Victoria person completely, and she gets angry when I ask questions about the financial arrangements. I don't know what to do." That night, I made the decision that would change everything. I couldn't continue protecting Victoria while innocent people were being destroyed. I couldn't prioritize family peace over justice for her victims. I started planning how to expose Victoria's crimes in a way that would ensure maximum protection for her victims and maximum consequences for her actions. The wedding provided the perfect opportunity. The decision to expose Victoria at her wedding wasn't made in anger, despite how it might have appeared to the horrified guests. It was the result of careful planning and strategic thinking that had consumed my life for the past month. I'd initially considered reporting Victoria's crimes to the Securities and Exchange Commission, the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, or the Seattle Police Department's White-Collar Crime Division, but each option presented significant challenges that could allow Victoria to escape consequences or destroy evidence before authorities could act. Financial crimes investigations moved slowly, often taking months or years to build prosecutable cases. Victoria was sophisticated enough to have created complex paper trails and legal structures that would take time to unravel. Meanwhile, she'd continue stealing from vulnerable clients, potentially destroying more lives while authorities gathered evidence. More concerning was Victoria's network of connections throughout Seattle's legal and financial communities. Her client list included judges, prosecutors, police officials, and regulatory authorities. She'd cultivated relationships with exactly the people who would be investigating her crimes, creating potential conflicts of interest that could compromise any official investigation. But a public exposure at her wedding, in front of 200 witnesses including many of her victims' family members, would create immediate accountability and make it impossible for Victoria to continue her crimes or escape consequences. I spent weeks refining my evidence presentation, organizing the most damaging recordings and documents into a compelling narrative that would be impossible to dismiss or explain away. The key was to focus on specific victims and concrete evidence, rather than abstract legal concepts that wedding guests might not understand. Mrs. Patterson's case was perfect for this purpose. The elderly widow was beloved in Seattle's social circles, known for her volunteer work with children's charities and her late husband's contributions to the arts community. Many of Victoria's wedding guests knew Mrs. Patterson personally and would be devastated to learn about her victimization. I documented every aspect of Victoria's theft from Mrs. Patterson's accounts, creating a timeline that showed how Victoria had gradually drained nearly $500,000 over 3 years. The evidence included recorded phone conversations where Victoria discussed Mrs. Patterson's increasing confusion and vulnerability, bank records showing unauthorized transfers, and forged documents that Victoria had used to steal assets. Harold Chen's case provided additional impact because his story would resonate with the many elderly guests at Victoria's wedding. At 93, Harold had early-stage dementia, but remained proud and independent. Victoria had convinced him to name her as his power of attorney and emergency contact, then used that authority to systematically steal his life savings while isolating him from potential advocates who might notice the theft. The recordings of Victoria and Marcus Webb discussing Harold's case revealed the calculated cruelty of their approach. He gets confused about dates and amounts, but he still has lucid moments where he asks good questions. We need to move faster before he has a clear day and realizes what's happening. The Martinez couple's case was perhaps the most heartbreaking because it involved two victims supporting each other through Eleanor's Alzheimer's diagnosis. Victoria had presented herself as a caring advisor who specialized in helping families navigate financial planning during medical crises. Instead, she'd used their trust and vulnerability to steal over $500,000 while they focused on Eleanor's deteriorating health. "They're so grateful for the help," Victoria had said in one recorded conversation. "Robert keeps thanking me for taking the financial burden off his shoulders so he can focus on caring for Eleanor. He has no idea we're bankrupting them." Beyond individual victim stories, I documented the broader scope of Victoria's criminal enterprise. Emerald Wealth Management had stolen over $3.2 million from 17 different clients over 5 years. The thefts were systematically targeting the most vulnerable members of society: elderly people dealing with social isolation, cognitive decline, recent bereavement, or serious medical issues. Victoria and Marcus had developed a sophisticated referral network that connected them with potential victims. They cultivated relationships with doctors, nursing homes, senior centers, and grief counselors who would recommend their services to families dealing with crisis situations. They positioned themselves as compassionate professionals who specialized in helping vulnerable seniors, when they were actually predators seeking easy targets. The wedding venue itself provided perfect symbolism for my revelation. The Fairmont Olympic Hotel ballroom, decorated with white roses and crystal, represented the elegant facade that Victoria used to hide her crimes. The assembled guests, Seattle's social and professional elite, represented the community whose trust Victoria had violated. The celebration of love and commitment provided stark contrast to Victoria's systematic betrayal of elderly clients who'd trusted her like family. I'd practiced my presentation dozens of times, refining the pacing and content to maximize impact while maintaining clarity. The recordings were edited to highlight the most damaging statements while providing sufficient context for listeners to understand the scope of Victoria's crimes. The visual evidence was organized to tell a compelling story, even to people with no financial expertise. Most importantly, I'd prepared for Victoria's inevitable attempts to discredit me or explain away the evidence. I knew she'd claim the recordings were fabricated, that the documents were taken out of context, that I was motivated by jealousy or mental illness. I'd anticipated every defense and prepared counter-evidence that would expose her lies. The decision to act at Victoria's wedding wasn't motivated by revenge, though I understood how it might appear that way. It was motivated by the knowledge that every day I delayed gave Victoria another opportunity to steal from vulnerable elderly people who trusted her completely. Mrs. Patterson's daughter had called again the previous week, reporting that her mother was now unable to afford her heart medication because of mysterious investment losses she couldn't explain. Harold Chen's neighbor had contacted Adult Protective Services because he'd been eating cat food when his grocery money mysteriously disappeared from his account. Victoria's victims were suffering immediate, concrete harm while she planned her elaborate wedding celebration. The contrast between her luxury and their deprivation made my decision inevitable. It was time to stop protecting the predator and start protecting her prey. The immediate aftermath of my revelation was chaos beyond anything I'd anticipated. The ballroom erupted in shocked conversations as guests struggled to process what they'd just heard. Some people began leaving immediately, unwilling to be associated with the unfolding scandal. Others clustered in groups, sharing what they knew about the clients I'd mentioned and trying to understand the scope of Victoria's crimes. Victoria herself stood frozen at the head table, her face cycling through denial, rage, and desperate calculation. The beautiful bride who'd humiliated me an hour earlier had transformed into a cornered animal looking for escape routes. "This is insane," she said into the microphone, her voice cracking with hysteria. "Riley is having some kind of breakdown. She's always been jealous of my success, and now she's trying to destroy my wedding with fabricated evidence and—" "The recordings are real, Victoria," I interrupted, my voice amplified by the sound system. "The bank records are real. The theft from Grandma Rose is real. And everyone in this room is going to hear exactly what you've been doing to elderly people who trusted you." James stepped forward, his face ashen. "Victoria, what is she talking about? What recordings?" Before Victoria could answer, our father's voice cut through the chaos. "Everyone stop." Dad's courtroom authority commanded immediate attention from the crowd. "Riley, I need you to step away from that microphone right now." "Victoria, we're leaving immediately." "No," I said firmly. "Nobody's leaving until everyone understands what Victoria has been doing. Mrs. Patterson is here tonight, Dad. Harold Chen's nephew is here. The Martinez family's attorney is here. They all deserve to know why their loved ones are suddenly unable to afford their medications." I could see Mrs. Patterson across the room, a elegant 86-year-old woman in a pale blue dress, looking confused and distressed as other guests whispered around her. She'd been invited to Victoria's wedding because Victoria had positioned herself as a beloved family friend. Now she was learning that her trusted advisor had stolen her life savings. "Mrs. Patterson," I called out, and the elderly woman looked up with recognition. "I'm so sorry you have to learn about this here, but Victoria has been stealing your money. The investment losses she told you about, they weren't real losses. She transferred your assets to accounts she controls." Mrs. Patterson's face crumpled with confusion and betrayal. "That can't be right. Victoria wouldn't. She's been so helpful, so caring." "She's been caring because caring is how she gains your trust before she robs you," I replied, hating the necessity of destroying this sweet woman's faith in someone she'd loved. Victoria finally found her voice again. "Mrs. Patterson, don't listen to her. Riley is sick. She's been having psychological problems for months. She's obsessed with destroying my happiness because she can't stand that I'm successful, and she's not." But Mrs. Patterson was no longer looking at Victoria with trust and affection. She was looking at her with the dawning horror of someone who'd finally seen through a beautiful mask to the monster underneath. Our mother pushed through the crowd, her face streaming with tears. "Riley, please stop this. Whatever you think Victoria has done, we can handle it privately as a family. You don't have to destroy her life in public." "I'm not destroying her life, Mom. I'm exposing her crimes. There's a difference." I looked at my mother, this accomplished physician, who'd somehow remained blind to her younger daughter's predatory nature. Victoria has been stealing from elderly people with dementia and Alzheimer's. She's been exploiting the most vulnerable members of our community for profit. How is that something we should handle privately? Because she's your sister, Mom said desperately. Because families protect each other. Victoria isn't protecting Harold Chen or Mrs. Patterson or any of her other victims. Why should I protect her? The argument that followed revealed the fault lines that had always existed in our family, but had never been openly acknowledged. Our parents, faced with irrefutable evidence of Victoria's crimes, immediately shifted into damage control mode, trying to minimize the public embarrassment rather than addressing the harm Victoria had caused. "Riley, you're being vindictive," Dad said, his lawyer's instincts taking over. "Even if Victoria made some poor financial decisions, destroying her wedding and her reputation isn't going to help anyone." "Poor financial decisions?" I laughed bitterly. "Dad, she's stolen over $3 million from 17 different elderly clients. This isn't poor judgment. It's systematic criminal fraud." "That's alleged criminal fraud," Dad corrected automatically. "You don't have the right to act as judge and jury. I have the right to warn potential victims about ongoing crimes. I have the right to speak the truth about someone who's been destroying innocent people's lives." Victoria suddenly lunged forward and grabbed the microphone. "Stop it," she screamed. "Just stop it. You've always hated me, Riley. You've always been jealous that people love me more than they love you. This is just your pathetic attempt to tear me down because you can't stand being the failure sister anymore." The mask had finally slipped completely. The charming, sophisticated woman, who'd built her career on manipulating trust, had revealed herself as someone consumed by narcissistic rage at being exposed. "I don't hate you, Victoria," I said quietly. "I hate what you've become. I hate that you've used the privileges our family gave you to destroy innocent people. I hate that you feel no guilt or remorse for the harm you've caused." "I haven't harmed anyone," Victoria shrieked. "I've helped elderly clients navigate complex financial decisions. If some investments didn't perform as expected, that's not my fault." But even as she spoke, I could see that many of the guests were no longer buying her performance. The recordings had been too clear, too detailed, too specific for anyone to dismiss as misunderstandings or investment losses. James finally spoke, his voice hollow with shock. "Victoria, I need you to tell me the truth. Did you steal money from these people?" Victoria looked at her new husband, this man she'd promised to love and honor just hours earlier, and I saw her make a calculation. She could continue denying the evidence and hope to manipulate her way out of consequences, or she could admit the truth and hope for forgiveness. She chose manipulation. "James, you know me," she said, reverting to the soft, vulnerable voice that had charmed our parents for 32 years. "You know I would never hurt innocent people. Riley is sick. She's been obsessed with destroying our relationship since the day we got engaged. This is all fabricated evidence from someone who can't stand to see me happy." But James was looking at her with the expression of someone who'd finally seen through a lie he'd wanted to believe. "The recordings," he said slowly. "Those were your voice in the recordings." Victoria's face went white as she realized her performance wasn't working anymore. The moment James questioned the recordings, Victoria's composure finally shattered completely. The elegant bride transformed into something desperate and dangerous, her mask of charm dissolving to reveal the predator underneath. "You want the whole truth?" Victoria snarled, turning back to the microphone with wild eyes. "Fine, I'll give you the whole truth about this family, and what it's really like being the perfect daughter everyone expects you to be." What followed was a confession more damaging than anything I could have planned. Victoria, in her narcissistic rage at being exposed, began revealing details about her crimes that went far beyond what I'd been able to document. "Yes, I took money from clients," she said into the microphone, her voice carrying across the stunned ballroom, "because these people are going to die anyway, and leave everything to ungrateful children who never visit them. At least I appreciated their company, listened to their stories, made them feel valued in their final years." The audacity of framing theft as compassion left the audience speechless. "Mrs. Patterson's daughter called twice a year," Victoria continued, pointing at the elderly woman who was now crying openly. "Twice a year. I called every week. I brought soup when she was sick. I remembered her birthday when her own family forgot. Why shouldn't I be compensated for that care?" "Because you weren't compensating yourself," I said, my voice steady despite the horror of watching Victoria justify her crimes. "You were stealing. There's a difference between fair compensation and criminal theft." "Criminal theft?" Victoria laughed bitterly. "What about emotional theft? What about Riley stealing 32 years of my life by being the responsible sister who made me look selfish in comparison? What about our parents stealing my childhood by expecting me to be perfect all the time?" The wedding guests were witnessing a complete psychological breakdown in real time. Victoria was revealing not just her crimes, but the twisted worldview that had enabled them. Harold Chen was dying alone, she continued, oblivious to the growing horror on the faces around her. His own family abandoned him in that apartment with no visitors except nurses. I gave him companionship, made him feel important, made his final years meaningful. Taking his money was just payment for services the family should have been providing. James stepped backward, as if Victoria had physically struck him. You're talking about stealing from dying elderly people like it's charity work. It is charity work, Victoria screamed. I gave these people more love and attention than their own families ever did. I made their lives better while taking assets they couldn't even remember they had. Everyone benefited. Mrs. Patterson can't afford her heart medication, I said quietly. Harold Chen has been eating cat food because his grocery money disappeared. How exactly did they benefit? For the first time, Victoria seemed to realize that her justifications weren't resonating with the audience. She looked around the ballroom at faces filled with disgust and horror, finally understanding that her charm offensive had failed completely. You don't understand, she said, her voice becoming smaller and more desperate. I never meant for anyone to get hurt. The money was just sitting there in accounts they barely monitored. They were happy with the attention I gave them, happier than they'd been in years, until they couldn't afford their medications or their rent, I replied, until they had to choose between food and heat, because their savings were gone. Victoria's face contorted with rage again. That's not my fault. That's the fault of families who dumped their elderly relatives and never checked on them. I provided a service that no one else was willing to provide. Theft isn't a service, Victoria. Exploitation isn't caregiving. Manipulation isn't love. The truth of those words seemed to penetrate Victoria's defenses for the first time. She looked around the ballroom again, seeing the expressions of people who'd known her for years and were now viewing her as a stranger. I want everyone to leave, she said suddenly. This is my wedding, and I want everyone to leave right now. But the guests were already leaving, not because Victoria demanded it, but because they couldn't bear to witness any more of her self-incriminating breakdown. The elegant celebration had become a crime scene, and no one wanted to be associated with what they'd witnessed. Mrs. Patterson was being helped toward the exit by several concerned friends, her face streaked with tears, as she finally understood the scope of her betrayal. Harold Chen's nephew was already on his phone, presumably calling attorneys or family members. The Martinez family's attorney was taking notes, documenting Victoria's admissions for future legal proceedings. Our parents stood frozen near the head table, watching their younger daughter destroy herself in front of 200 witnesses. Dad's face showed the expression of a lawyer who just watched his client confess to multiple felonies in open court. Mom looked like a doctor who'd finally diagnosed a terminal illness she'd been refusing to acknowledge. Victoria, Mom said quietly, we need to call David Hensley. We need legal representation before you say anything else. I don't need a lawyer, Victoria replied, with the false confidence of someone in complete denial about her situation. I haven't done anything wrong. I provided valuable services to grateful clients, and I was compensated fairly for that work. James finally found his voice again. Victoria, you just admitted to stealing millions of dollars from elderly people with dementia. You need to stop talking immediately. I admitted to being appreciated by lonely people whose families neglected them, Victoria corrected. I admitted to forming meaningful relationships with clients who valued my company more than their absent children did. Even in the face of overwhelming evidence and her own confessions, Victoria remained committed to her narrative of justified theft and charitable exploitation. She genuinely believed that providing companionship to lonely elderly people entitled her to steal their life savings. As the ballroom continued to empty, Victoria stood alone at the head table in her expensive wedding dress, surrounded by the wreckage of her career, her marriage, and her freedom. The golden child who'd spent 32 years believing that rules didn't apply to her was finally facing the consequences of that delusion. This isn't over, she said to me as the last guests filed out. You think you've won something, but you've just destroyed our entire family for nothing. Those people were going to die anyway. Their money was going to be wasted on medical bills and nursing homes. At least I gave them some happiness first. You gave them poverty and betrayal, I replied. You gave them the ultimate violation of trust from someone they loved, like family. As security guards approached to escort Victoria from the premises, she made one final attempt to assert control over the narrative. I was a good granddaughter to these people, she called out. I was the daughter their real families never were. Taking their money was just inheritance. The words followed me as I left the ballroom, carrying the weight of having destroyed my sister's life while saving her victims from further harm. 6 months later, I sat in a federal courthouse watching Victoria receive a 20-year sentence for elder fraud, money laundering, and racketeering. She'd maintained her innocence throughout the trial, insisting that she'd provided valuable companionship to grateful clients who'd voluntarily compensated her for her care. The prosecution had built their case around the evidence I'd provided, supplemented by additional victims who'd come forward after Victoria's wedding confession went viral on social media. The final count was 23 elderly victims who'd lost a combined total of $4.7 million to Victoria's scheme. Mrs. Patterson testified via video link from her hospital bed, where she was recovering from a stroke triggered by the stress of learning about Victoria's betrayal. Her daughter read a victim impact statement describing how the theft had forced her mother into poverty and medical crisis in her final years. "My mother trusted Victoria like a granddaughter," the statement read. She included Victoria in family celebrations, worried about Victoria's well-being, and considered Victoria one of the most important people in her life. Learning that Victoria had been systematically robbing her was devastating beyond description. "My mother died believing she was a burden to everyone who'd ever cared about her." Harold Chen's nephew delivered a statement that brought several jurors to tears. "My uncle spent his final months confused and frightened, unable to understand where his money had gone, or why he couldn't afford basic necessities. He kept asking if he'd done something wrong, if he deserved to be punished." Victoria convinced a proud, independent man that he was losing his mind when she was actually stealing his sanity along with his savings. Victoria showed no emotion during the victim impact statements. She sat beside her attorney wearing an expensive navy suit, maintaining the composure she'd perfected over decades of manipulation. Even facing prison time, she couldn't acknowledge the harm she'd caused or express genuine remorse for her crimes. When given the opportunity to address the court before sentencing, Victoria delivered a statement that confirmed everything I'd come to understand about her character. "Your Honor, I want to be clear that I never intended to harm anyone. I developed genuine relationships with clients who appreciated my company and assistance with complex financial matters. If there were misunderstandings about compensation or investment outcomes, I sincerely regret any confusion that may have resulted." She couldn't even admit guilt while being sentenced for crimes she'd confessed to on video. Our parents attended every day of the trial, sitting behind Victoria in a show of family support that I found both admirable and heartbreaking. They'd hired the best criminal defense attorney in Seattle, mortgaged their house to pay legal fees, and endured weeks of testimony detailing their daughter's systematic abuse of vulnerable victims. Dad's law firm had dissolved under the scandal. Too many clients had connections to Victoria's victims for the practice to survive. Mom had taken early retirement from her medical practice after colleagues began questioning her judgment and ethical standards. Victoria's crimes had destroyed their professional reputations along with their family legacy. They blamed me for the destruction, of course. Not directly. Our parents were too sophisticated for crude accusations, but through pointed comments about family loyalty and the importance of handling problems privately. They couldn't acknowledge that I'd saved additional victims from further harm, because doing so would require admitting that Victoria deserved to be stopped. "She would have figured it out eventually," Mom said during one particularly difficult family dinner. "Victoria isn't a bad person. She just made some poor choices under financial pressure. If you'd come to us privately, we could have helped her make restitution and get treatment. She stole money from Alzheimer's patients, Mom." She laughed about exploiting confused elderly people for profit. "Those aren't poor choices. They're indicators of antisocial personality disorder." "She's your sister," Dad replied, as if biological relationship excused criminal behavior. She deserved a chance to correct her mistakes before having her life destroyed publicly. But Victoria's victims had deserved protection from ongoing harm, and that protection had required public exposure of her crimes. I'd chosen justice for innocent victims over protection for a family predator, and I'd make the same choice again. The civil restitution process had recovered approximately 60% of the stolen assets, providing some compensation to Victoria's victims, but nowhere near full restoration of their losses. Mrs. Patterson's family used their settlement to pay for better medical care during her final months. Harold Chen's estate was able to recover enough money to pay for a proper burial that honored his service as a World War II veteran. Marcus Webb, Victoria's business partner, had pled guilty to conspiracy charges and received a 15-year sentence in exchange for his cooperation with prosecutors. His testimony had provided crucial details about their targeting methodology and victim selection process. I'd started a support group for families affected by elder financial abuse, using my experience to help other people navigate the complex emotions of discovering that someone they'd trusted was actually a predator. The group met monthly at a community center, providing space for people to share their experiences without judgment or shame. The hardest part isn't the money, said one group member whose father had been victimized by a financial advisor similar to Victoria. The hardest part is losing faith in your own judgment, wondering how you could have been so wrong about someone you thought you knew. I understood that feeling completely. Victoria's crimes had forced me to reevaluate everything I'd believed about family, loyalty, and the nature of evil. I'd learned that predators often hide behind masks of charm and respectability, that they target the most vulnerable members of society, and that enabling their behavior through misplaced loyalty only creates additional victims. As Victoria was led away in handcuffs after her sentencing, she looked back at our parents with an expression of betrayed innocence, as if she couldn't understand why everyone was overreacting to her poor choices. She'd spent 32 years believing that rules didn't apply to her, and even prison couldn't penetrate that fundamental delusion. Our family would never recover from the damage Victoria had caused, but her victims could finally find peace knowing that justice had been served. Mrs. Patterson died knowing that Victoria would face consequences for her betrayal. Harold Chen's family found closure in seeing Victoria held accountable for his suffering. The golden child who'd been protected and enabled her entire life had finally faced the reality that charm and manipulation couldn't overcome evidence and justice. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is refuse to enable their worst impulses, even when that refusal destroys the relationship forever. Sometimes family loyalty requires betraying family members who've betrayed innocent people. Sometimes the truth is more important than keeping the peace.